Oi, desculpa interromper seu podcast. Você vende em marketplaces e tá sem margem de lucro? Crie sua loja online na Nuvem Shop e venda sem taxas abusivas, com planos grátis ou avançados para todos os tamanhos de negócio. Grandes empreendedores como Joel J, Camila Farani e mais de 130 mil lojas estão com a gente. Acesse nosso site Nuvem Shop. A paixão por empreender nos une.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am pleased to announce that I am joined by Sophie Bacchus-Waterman. Sophie, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show.
This is your first visit to the show, isn't it?
Yes, but I have been a listener for quite some time, so very pleased to be here.
Oh, I love that. I love to hear that. Well, I found you on Twitter because you were talking about Elizabeth Boleyn, the mother of Anne Boleyn, which is a fascinating subject. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But why are you studying Elizabeth Boleyn?
Because I'm writing the first solo biography of Elizabeth Boleyn, and I wanted this book to have been written. That's why I'm writing it. It was the book that I wanted to read, that I wish somebody had done. Elizabeth Norton has a wonderful joint biography of the Boleyn women. I'm sure you're aware of it, and a lot of the listeners will know of it. But in terms of a singular study of Elizabeth, no one had done it. And I wondered, why was there such a gap of information? There's this really tantalizing references in a lot of biographies of Anne, where they will say either Elizabeth Boleyn served in the households of Elizabeth of York and Catherine of Aragon, or just Catherine of Aragon. And I was like, that's a story there. What do you mean? She had this career, certainly in the household of Catherine of Aragon. That's fascinating. That was really one of the earliest things that got me interested in doing this research and thinking, what is out there? Is there more to say? Particularly inspired by the biography of Thomas Boleyn by Lauren Mackay. You know, this question of like, who were the wider Boleyn family? Who was around Anne? What are the stories that we're missing? And as a particular historian of women, with an interest in ladies in waiting and court service, it really seemed like just the perfect project to get into. It was quite daunting at first, you know, because you're kind of retelling the story of Anne. But that was really what got me interested. And then when I found that there was actually a lot more to be said, a lot more in primary sources and a lot of incorrect information in secondary sources that had no basis in primary sources, I was like, well, somebody's got to do this. And somehow it became me. So here I am, the advocate spokesperson for Elizabeth Boleyn.
I love it. She needs to have her story told. I feel like the one thing we always hear about her is that she was the mother of Anne and George and Mary. And when Henry was looking to wed Anne Boleyn, there's that famous quote, "Never the mother," right? And
oh, that's one of the yes. It's great that you've mentioned that, because I've just finished writing about that actually. And one of the few things we do say about Elizabeth Boleyn is that she possibly had an affair with Henry VIII, but probably not, but maybe. And I knew that was looming in the book. I was going to have to write about that at some point. And what seems to happen in a lot of secondary sources when they talk about that affair, but a potential affair that didn't happen, is that they mentioned the sources that were contemporary to Elizabeth's life. And there were, you know, maybe 4 or 5 of these accusations slung around in her lifetime. And then Nicholas Sander walks in with his insane, you know, posthumous accusations. And this discussion gets lumped in with a larger conversation about Elizabeth's posthumous representation and reputation. And I think, no, we need to separate those two conversations. With these accusations that she and Henry had an affair in her youth, which didn't happen, probably. You never say never, right? But I don't think it did. With those accusations, what were the ones that she would have been aware of in her life? Who was it that was saying them, and what were their motivations? And that was really important. I felt like, even though when people mention those accusations, which is one of the few things they do talk about with Elizabeth, and then they say it probably didn't happen though, this is a whole life boiled down to a woman who might have slept with her son-in-law. That's just crazy. She had a whole life outside of Anne and Mary and George, a whole life before that, a fascinating childhood from what we can pick up on, and a very short life after the deaths of Anne and George as well. And a lot, as I started to do my own research into primary sources, find out more about her life, I realized that while we don't have any interiority, I'll say straight away, I haven't found a trove of letters, unfortunately. I haven't found some interiority. It is all just about movements and about placing her in certain places, talking about her wider family and speculation, educated speculation. There's still so much more to say than, oh, she maybe had an affair with Henry VIII, but probably not.
Right. She was so much more than that. And I would really like to start with her lineage, her ancestry, because she comes from a very powerful family, the Howard family.
Yes, the infamous Howard family.
Yeah. And I think people sometimes forget that she came from the Howard family and what that means and all of the people that she's related to because of that.
Yeah, it's kind of a joke, isn't it? Everyone's related to the Howards somehow. She had so many siblings and half siblings because her mother was married before marrying Thomas Howard, so there's multiple Thomas Howards in this story, as I'm sure listeners and you will know. This is Thomas Howard, her father, who was arrested after the Battle of Bosworth, who fought on the side of Richard III and was arrested, sent to the Tower of London when Elizabeth was probably about 5 years old, roughly, if we assume that she was born in 1480, which is the generally accepted date. So her mother had a previous marriage to Humphrey Bourchier, who died at the Battle of Barnet. And so Elizabeth Howard, later Elizabeth Boleyn, had just so many half siblings by that marriage, and then her own Howard siblings. But I'd say that ones of most historical note were her sister Muriel, her brother Edmund Howard, who would later go on to be the father of Catherine Howard, and then her brother Thomas Howard, later 3rd Duke of Norfolk. One of the worst men in Tudor England, I think, is generally accepted. So the Howards were particularly powerful. They had a long history of court service. Elizabeth's grandfather, John Howard, her father, Thomas Howard, were both courtiers at Richard III's court, and they were raised to the peerage just before the Battle of Bosworth. So her father became the Earl of Surrey, and then her grandfather, the 1st Duke of Norfolk. And so they were a particularly powerful family. But then what happened is they fought on the side of Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth, as loyal courtiers they would have done. John Howard died, and then Thomas Howard, this is our Elizabeth's father, was arrested and taken to the Tower of London and stripped of that peerage. He was the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, but, given the death of his father, but no more. He was in the Tower, he was arrested for treason, and that was that. So all that power was gone in the aftermath of the Battle of Bosworth. So I think, the Howards were able to claw their way back up to prominence. And then by 1495, Thomas Howard married Anne of York, but that took some time. There was about a 10-year period when the Howards were really kind of on the out. So when we think about the marriage of, maybe I'm going off track a little bit here, when we think about the marriage of Elizabeth Howard to Thomas Boleyn, and people think, oh, she was so much higher rank than him. That is true, but their social standing had diminished quite considerably at the end of the 15th century. At the time, Elizabeth Howard married Thomas Boleyn.
Yeah.
So it's not a rambling answer, I'm sorry.
No. See, I think it's so interesting. One of the other people, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Elizabeth was related to was Margaret Bryan.
Yes, they were half siblings. They were half sisters.
I think that's fascinating too.
That is, you think about all of these connections and all of these connections by marriage or by blood, and how Anne Boleyn was surrounded by so many members of her family in her household when she became queen. And obviously this is pure speculation here, how many of the appointments were due to her mother's influence during Anne's queenship. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, I'm sure we'll talk about it later. But yeah, there were so many Howards and so many Boleyns who kind of were able to get positions in Anne's household when she was queen. And all of these connections, all of these marriages and all of these siblings, I was particularly interested. One of the early sort of draws to this project was Muriel Howard, the sister of Elizabeth, because she's somebody about whom I've heard very little. And there was this dreadful speculation, misunderstanding, misread in the late 19th century that Elizabeth Boleyn died in 1512 in childbirth. You might have come across that in some secondary sources.
Interesting.
Okay. It was, the Victorians were crazy.
Yes.
You know, we have to blame with them to blame for just so many issues. So there was a misreading of a primary source, because Muriel Howard died in December 1512, and she died in childbirth, and her will is still extant, and I talk about it in the book, and you know, kind of how she died of childbed fever, same thing that killed Jane Seymour. And so this misreading of this primary source led to this temporary debate in the late 19th century that actually had surprising longevity into, I think, the 1970s, that Elizabeth Boleyn died in 1512 because they misread this document that was about her sister to be about her. And so what you've got is these Victorian biographies of Anne, which say, you know, yes, very romantically, they're like, oh yes, little Nan was taken to the grave of her departed mother, you know, and with her father, and all of this complete nonsense that's just not true and very Victorian and very romanticized, in order to make later references to Anne Elizabeth Boleyn, the wife of Thomas, make sense. They invented just whole cloth a second woman, a second wife for Thomas Boleyn, also by the name of Elizabeth. And they're, you know, really disparaging comments by these Victorian historians about her. You know, she was a woman of no note. She was from some vague Norfolk family. Thomas Boleyn taught her to read and write, was one bizarre one that I came across. And it, you know, on the one hand, it's quite funny to think, oh, they were so wrong, because they were. However, I try to keep in mind that they didn't have access to the kind of things that we have access to now, in terms of perhaps, you know, access to certain documents or understanding, or the backing of secondary sources that we have now in the work that's been done to disprove that. And interestingly enough, I came across an article written by James Gardner, the editor of Letters and Papers, who was furious about this misunderstanding. And he wrote in a review of a biography of Anne, you know, this is a common misunderstanding that Elizabeth Boleyn died in 1512, but she didn't. She didn't. And he was out there trying to correct people, but it was a really long-standing myth. Yeah, it's very interesting. Sorry, why did I start talking about that? I've completely forgotten what the question was.
Oh, I just mentioned about her being related to Margaret Bryan.
Yeah. Oh, and then somehow we got here.
I love it. I love when conversations go like this, because that's when the interesting stuff comes out. And I love that you brought up the Victorians, because that's something I mention a lot on this show, about how the Victorians just kind of did their own thing. You know, it was all about coming up with the best story possible. And how great is it for Anne Boleyn to go to her mother's grave?
Yeah, and how tragic is it to give her this story and this, you know, tragic dead mother, and then this second stepmother, or rather this only stepmother, also called Elizabeth. It's very interesting. And it's just, I think they had these ideas and then ran with them, you know, and ran with them. And it's been very interesting. I talk about it quite early on in the book, that there was this belief, and that actually, for all the impact that Elizabeth Boleyn, the real Elizabeth Boleyn, has had on the story of Anne, if you want to see it through the lens of Anne Boleyn's story, she may as well have died in Anne's youth. Because really, in secondary sources, in Anne's biographies, Elizabeth is there to give birth to the children. And then we discuss, you know, the birth order and the complications of that. And then she disappears again from the story, possibly making an appearance to chaperone Anne during the courtship with Henry, which she did do. And then that's it, really. She doesn't have any impact on the story, but we know that this is a woman who was so important to Anne. When Anne was in the Tower, one of the first things she said was, "Oh, my mother, thou wilt die with sorrow." She obviously cared about her mother a great deal. And in one of the few letters we know that Anne wrote to her friend Bridget Winfield, she mentions her mother and how much she loves her and cares for her. So if we allow that Anne was a strong woman, who had very influential role models in her life, female role models in her life, then surely her mother must have been somebody worthy of that kind of respect that Anne had for her, especially when you consider the fact that Anne spent a lot of her childhood abroad, and they possibly only saw each other once at the Field of Cloth of Gold until Anne returned to England. So even given that distance, during Anne's formative years, Elizabeth Boleyn must have been a woman to command that kind of respect and love, and somebody who Anne relied on, speculatively. But we hear it from Anne herself. We hear it from Anne herself that she loved her mother. So
I love that we're seeing this side of her. Before we really go into Elizabeth as a mother, I want to go back to her childhood a little bit and dig a little bit deeper there. She came from the Howard family, which you mentioned kind of fell after the Wars of the Roses. I'm curious, we talk about wardships. Did she ever have her wardship purchased by anyone? Did she spend time in another household at all?
Not that I was able to find. So as far as I could tell, her mother, so this is Elizabeth Tilney, our Elizabeth's mother. Everyone's called Elizabeth or Thomas. I'll try and clarify. So Elizabeth Tilney, our Elizabeth's mother, after her husband was arrested after the Battle of Bosworth, she seems to have left their home in Ashwell-Thorpe Manor in Norfolk and gone to London to try to seek an audience, possibly with Henry VII, to plead for mercy for the life of her husband. And then she went to she doesn't seem to have been granted that. She then went to the Isle of Sheppey. And from there, she wrote a letter to John Paston, of Paston Letters fame, which is how we get this information. And she says in that letter that she has her children with her. So presumably, this is Elizabeth Boleyn, possibly her daughter Muriel and her sons with her. And she explains that in her absence, men had gone to Ashwell-Thorpe Manor to try to seize it in the name of the king, because obviously, having been arrested, Thomas Howard's possessions now go to Henry. But Ashwell-Thorpe Manor belonged to Elizabeth Tilney. It was hers, not his, so they couldn't seize it. She writes to John Paston for help, seems to get it, and then returns to Ashwell-Thorpe Manor until her husband's released from the Tower of London in what's the year? 1489. Yes, I'm dreadful with dates, but it's 1489. He's released, and then he's sent north to be the Lieutenant of the North in Yorkshire. I always found it really ironic that he's sent to live in Sheriff Hutton Castle, which was a favourite abode of Richard III. So you think, here is this man who lost everything fighting for Richard III, who's now being sent to the former king's home as Lieutenant of the North. And in Yorkshire as well, up north, there was still a strong pro-Richard III contingent. There was still this sentiment that they were for Richard III, even in the reign of Henry VII. And so just really interesting to just imagine what that must have been like for Thomas Howard being up there now as a servant of the king. So he was Lieutenant of the North until seemingly 1498, and his family went with him. We've got a poem by John Skelton called The Garland of the Laurel, which talks about the Countess of Surrey, this being Elizabeth Tilney, our Elizabeth's mother, and the young women in her charge. So it seems like Elizabeth Boleyn spent some of her teenage years with these young women in her mother's household, and they all must have gone there to get their education, as young women sometimes did in the households of other high noble women. What's fascinating about the women who are mentioned in that poem, we've got Elizabeth Howard, later Elizabeth Boleyn, Muriel, we've got Marjorie Wentworth, the mother of Jane Seymour, who was there. Isn't that fascinating? We can say nothing more about it. We don't know anything about that relationship, but she was there as well. So we can place Elizabeth Boleyn tentatively in Yorkshire for her teenage years up until roughly 1498, possibly 1499. We know that Thomas Howard returned north between 1498, which is the last recorded duty that he performed as Lieutenant of the North, and then November 1499 when he was present at the trial of Perkin Warbeck. So some point in that window, he returned south. And if we assume that his wife and children went with him too, then we can then place Elizabeth Boleyn, Elizabeth Howard back south at the end of the 15th century.
So is there any indication that Elizabeth Howard / Boleyn served in the household of Elizabeth of York?
There is none. This is, again, one of those things that I was really curious to get to the bottom of, because there was, again, a lot of discrepancies between secondary sources on this. Some people say, yes, she did. And then others say, no, she didn't. The ones who say she did never cite a source. They never cite a primary source. And I was thinking, where did this come from, this belief? Because you've got the death of Elizabeth of York in 1503. And then there's that very brief window. If we assume that Elizabeth Howard was back south from, let's say, 1498, there's a brief window during which she could have served in Elizabeth of York's household. But I can't find her anywhere in primary sources that talk about Elizabeth of York's ladies-in-waiting. I can find her sister, Muriel, who by that point, by 1500, was married to John Grey, Viscount Lisle. So she was then Viscountess Lisle. So there is a Viscountess Lisle, this being Muriel, in some primary sources from Henry VII's reign. I believe off the top of my head, Muriel accompanied Margaret Tudor to Scotland to marry James IV. And then she appears at the funeral of Elizabeth of York. But I couldn't find Elizabeth Howard anywhere in the primary sources. This seems to be something that originated in secondary sources and then has just been accepted and discussed. I'm absolutely willing to be wrong about this, of course. If anyone knows where this came from, please tell me, because so far I've tracked it down to some secondary sources published in 2007-ish is the earliest reference that I can find to this. If anyone knows of any primary sources, I would love to know, because it drove me crazy. I haven't yet been able to definitively say where this belief came from, but certainly as far as I can see, it has no basis in primary sources. We don't see Elizabeth Boleyn at court until 1509 at the coronation of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon.
Oh, okay. So we see her there in 1509 at the coronation. Was she a participant or just a spectator?
She seems to have been a participant. She received some gowns. She received 2 gowns for the coronation. And she's listed as riding in a carriage along with certainly her sister and then a couple of other women as well. She's listed, what's really interesting is she's listed as the rank of Baroness. I don't know why that is. It might have been her Howard lineage by that point that puts her with the other women of higher rank. So she was definitely a participant. I believe that she probably joined Catherine of Aragon's household shortly before the coronation. I doubt that that would have been her first kind of role in the Queen's household. It's really difficult to date it. I do talk about it a little bit when I cover this period in the book. So yeah, that's the first time we see her at court, is 1509.
Okay, so I think you said she was born in 1580, so that would have made her 29?
Yes, it would have made it quite late. But it was quite a late arrival for court. But when you think about the Howard's position and how Elizabeth was north, if we assume that she was north for that time from until 1498 or 1499, then you've got that brief window where I can't find her in the records. And then you've got the death of Elizabeth of York in 1503. That then puts an end to the need for certainly ladies in waiting at court until Catherine of Aragon. So there's that gap there.
Yeah.
And she was possibly at court, before then, before 1509. I just can't find her. A huge part of this whole process has been me trying to accept that it's a lot of it's educated speculation or saying maybe the source hasn't survived, maybe she wasn't referenced. I think that people who read the book, which is not due out until the end of next year, some people will probably be unhappy with the amount that I've suggested that Elizabeth Boleyn was involved. in certain events that we don't know she was involved in. For example, the birth of Elizabeth I, Princess Elizabeth. I think that she was probably there for that. I don't have any direct evidence. I just think that it seems likely. So you said before we started recording that you had Matt Lewis on the other day. There's something wonderful that he says when he talks about the Princess in the Tower mystery. And he says, there's human evidence when it comes to certain aspects of history. And that's been a huge influence on me and how I've looked at this. Where we can't find Elizabeth Boleyn in primary sources, certainly during Anne's queenship, you've got to think, okay, but what's the most likely thing? We know that Elizabeth had lodgings at several of the palaces. There's records in the pay books of James Needham for lots of repairs throughout Anne's queenship. So Elizabeth Boleyn had lodgings at court, several of the palaces. Anne was close to her. She was under a lot of pressure when she gave birth to Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth. It's likely that her mother was there. We don't have a list of the women who attended Anne when she gave birth to Elizabeth I. So it makes sense. I think there's been a lot of idea because we can't find many references to Elizabeth Boleyn, direct references. The assumption is then, well, she must not have been there. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and she was there certainly more than we've allowed for. I've gone off topic.
No.
Sorry.
This is such a fascinating topic. Okay, so let's talk about her marriage to George Boleyn. Was she ever connected to anybody prior to George Boleyn?
She was. There was, oh gosh, bear with me a moment. I have it in my notes. Let's see. There was discussion of a marriage prior to Thomas Boleyn, but actually the Howards and the Boleyns knew each other for many years before. And I didn't know this until I read the biography of by Claire Martin, about the medieval Boleyns, heirs of ambition. In that, she talks about how the Howard and the Boleyn families knew each other for decades before the marriage of Elizabeth Howard and Thomas Boleyn. So it was probably arranged by their parents, as in often the way. Here we are. So it's possible that the Howards planned to marry Elizabeth to Henry Bourchier, the second Earl of Essex, after John Howard was granted wardship of him by Richard III. So then obviously you've got the imprisonment of Elizabeth's father, which then puts paid to that arrangement, if there was one. I only found one suggestion that was the case in, I believe, a master's dissertation from the 1980s. I would have to check my source. That's the only suggestion that I could find, and it doesn't seem to have been based in primary sources. It just seems to be because their wardship was purchased, and so possibly that was going to happen.
Right.
Besides that, there's no other suggestion that Elizabeth Howard was going to marry anybody else.
With that last name, was she related to him?
Probably distantly. I haven't sat down and worked out the family tree. You know how it is.
Yes.
It's related. Yeah, because the last name got me as well. Maybe I'll add that because that's currently not in the book. I do wonder how they were related. It must have been distant enough that it was okay, or maybe they were going to get, dispensation, or, how it was back then.
Keep it in the family.
Exactly.
Okay, so what year did she marry Thomas Boleyn?
I wish we knew.
I wish
we knew.
Okay.
We don't know. We don't have a date for that marriage. So if we assume, so her sister was married by November 1500, and Muriel was the younger of the two sisters, probably.
Okay.
So that can be, let's put that as the latest date, because it was likely that Elizabeth was married before her younger sister. And then if we assume that she came back between 1498 and 1499, that gives us a brief window of her marriage to Thomas. Her jointure was settled on her in, I want to say, July of 1501. So she was married before then. But besides that, we can't put a more accurate date on it. I went into this project with high hopes that I would find, some hidden evidence of the date of their marriage, but I wasn't able to find anything, unfortunately. Yeah, it's generally accepted that it was 1498 or 1499. And then that she was pregnant shortly after. One of the things we do know about their early marriage is that Thomas Boleyn says many years later that his wife gave him every year a child. If we take him literally, then she was almost constantly pregnant, which also explains why she wouldn't have been at court probably before 1509, because she was too busy being at home, having kids, recovering from having kids, having more kids. Yeah, so we can't date it accurately, unfortunately. It would go a long way, I think, to help answer that age-old question of when was Anne Boleyn born. I had to almost have an ad break in the book where I was talking about Elizabeth, I was keeping it with Elizabeth, and then you get to the birth of Anne. And I was like, I have to just take a pause, discuss the whole, theory about Anne's birth date and what's going on there, put forward a likely possibility, and then go back to Elizabeth. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So she has for sure 3 kids.
Yes.
Anne, George, and Mary, whatever order. We're not even going to go there, right?
It will take, I think it'll be a whole other separate podcast. You should do one. That'd be really interesting. So it's generally accepted that Mary was the eldest, and then it was Anne and then George.
Okay.
And then she also had we know that she had 2 other children, that she and Thomas had 2 other children. Another Thomas Boleyn, and then a Henry as well. The only way that we know about those births is because of the small crosses that are in St. Peter's Church and Penshurst Church that mark those births and then their deaths. There was a brief discussion a couple of years ago that those children survived to adulthood, but I don't think it's likely. We can't find any evidence of them at court or any references to them at all.
Okay.
They probably died in infancy. I believe that the birth order was Thomas Boleyn the younger, obviously with the tradition of naming your first son after the father.
Yeah.
It was probably and this covers like 10 pages of the current working draft of the book. So I'll say very briefly, because it's a whole other separate podcast. I believe that the birth order was Thomas the younger, Mary, Anne, Henry, and then George. That's the theory, but I think it's just one of those things that will never be proven. All we know is that they had 3 children that survived to adulthood, and then 2 sons that seem to have died quite young, and possibly more children as well, about whom the evidence just hasn't survived. We just don't know.
Yeah. It's the theory that Thomas Jr. was the eldest makes complete sense.
Yeah,
and then
the rest are all up for grabs, and what year was Anne Boleyn born? And there was there's also been the theory put forward that off the top of my head, it was Thomas the younger whose cross is at Penshurst. Actually, let me just not misinform. Let me just check this very quickly.
Yeah, and I was just at Penshurst this summer too. I didn't even put 2 and 2 together that he would have been there.
Was it him or was it Henry now? Yes, so it was Thomas Boleyn the younger. It's been suggested that Thomas the younger was born in 1521, because that's when Thomas Boleyn became the keeper of Penshurst Place. But I don't really think that's likely. It seems much more likely that as newlyweds in their youth, it seems very odd that they would have had a series of children early on in their marriage, and then 20 years later, it's possible that Thomas the younger, but also to have named him Thomas when you don't name, surely his name, his name being Thomas means that he probably was the first son who then died.
Which makes sense. But also she would have been quite old by that time too.
It would have been, yeah, exactly, in 1521. And yeah, I mean, it's been put forward as a theory. And that's it. I think, all that we can do with a lot of these cases is suggest, the sources don't change unless we find something new. The way we look at them changes. So I'm not saying that I'm correct, but it seems to me more likely that it was a series of children in the very late 15th century and then into the early 16th century as well.
Okay. Like many mothers of the time, especially of her status, I'm going to assume that Elizabeth educated her children.
Seems likely, yes. Have you been to Hever Castle?
I did not get the no. I didn't. I was close. I drove by it.
Yeah, on your next trip is wonderful. Owen Emerson has done some lovely pictures of some of the rooms in Hever Castle with imagined scenes of the Boleyn's childhood there, with Elizabeth sitting there and, embroidering, and it's just lovely. She probably did have a hand in her children's education. I was recently speaking with another researcher who suggested that perhaps Elizabeth taught Anne and Mary some French in their youth before they went abroad, which I love. I hadn't even considered that, but I think that's wonderful. Yeah, she probably did have a hand in their education, which I think would have gone a long way to the close relationship that she certainly had with Anne. We unfortunately don't have much, if any, evidence for her relationships with George and Mary at all. We'll probably talk about it later, the whole Mary Boleyn thing with her second marriage to William Stafford and all of that. Elizabeth was involved there, but we don't have much evidence for the closeness there, but it's probably likely that she did educate those children at home.
Yeah, okay. I love that we're talking about her relationship with her children and you bringing up Anne Boleyn's fondness for her mother, but we don't see that until we have the evidence in the letters. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Until much later. Yeah. And there's not much. There's not much there. Like I said, there's the letter written to Bridget Wingfield, and then there's Anne's comments in the Tower, and then there is Elizabeth during Anne's queenship as well. So it makes sense that of all of the children, of course, we'd have the most evidence of her relationship with Anne. But what I find really interesting is that, to jump ahead a little bit, when Anne was receiving the infamous love letters from Henry VIII in mid-1520s, Elizabeth Boleyn would have probably been at Hever for that point, because she'd left Catherine of Aragon's service. The latest I could find her in Catherine of Aragon's household was 1522, and then she seems to have left, which is also the same year that Mary and Anne entered Catherine of Aragon's service. So it's possible that Elizabeth left as her children began their court careers. It's possible that the rumours of the affair between Mary Boleyn and Henry VIII is what drove Elizabeth away from court, possibly embarrassment or shame, don't know. But she seems to have left active court service in around 1522. So therefore she was at Hever. We lose sight of her from 1522 to 1527 when she returns to court with Anne. There's one mention of her going to a local family for one day in 1526. And then that's it. There's just a 5-year silence. But that's because she was at Hever. And so when Anne was also at Hever, 1526, it would have been her mother who was there when Anne was receiving those letters from Henry. And there's a really interesting reference in one of Henry's letters to Elizabeth. He says, I have been told that the opinion in which I left you is totally changed, and you would not come to court either with your mother, if you could, or in any other manner. So is that Anne saying to Henry, I don't want to come to court with my mother? Or is this Elizabeth saying, I don't want you to go to court, I won't go with you? We don't know. But that's really interesting. What was Elizabeth's take on Henry's relationship with Anne? I've jumped ahead massively in the timeline here, but it's obviously so important it looms large, doesn't it?
It does. That's really interesting. There's so much about those letters I don't know. So that was really an interesting thing for you to bring up. Well, you brought up 1527, and we all know that her daughter Mary's husband, William Carey, died in 1528. Yeah. Do we know if Elizabeth was there for her daughter at the time? Do you have any record?
Don't have any evidence of that. But to be fair, it isn't something that I'd actually considered looking into deeply. You've given me another section of the book. It's very much a work in progress. I have a deadline and it's coming together, but there are so many avenues That's amazing. Thank you. Because I hadn't considered looking into that at all. I don't know. The answer right now is I don't know because I haven't looked into it. But that's so exciting.
I know Mary Boleyn is almost as difficult to research as her mother, so I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how much
Yeah,
you're
I
going
don't
to
know.
get for
It's definitely going to be anything, even if it's just speculation. It's just something overlooked. Definitely. It's such a multifaceted story. And when I first started to do my research, I was absolutely laser focused. I didn't think about Anne. I didn't think about anything. I was just like, where can I find Elizabeth? And so one of the earliest things that I did for the project is sit down and chart the evidence for Elizabeth's whereabouts, just basically with no kind of speculative gaps. Just she was here on this date, she was here on this date, and such and such. You go through and you do that. And I consider those sightings, those like primary source sightings, to be like the bones of the project. And then in between those, you've got the tissue of speculation, where, for example, we lose sight of her from 1522 to 1527. She was at Hever. I believe there's a reference in one of the ambassador's dispatches to Anne not wishing to leave her mother in Kent. So it's like, okay, so Elizabeth was at Hever. We don't know what she was doing day to day, but we know what a woman of her station running a household would have done. And so, there's been wonderful scholarship about aristocratic women in England and what their lives look like. And so you fill that gap by saying, well, we don't know, but here's what another woman of her station would have been doing. This is what her days would have looked like. Yeah. And that's how I managed to fill a lot of those gaps. But in doing that, in focusing so particularly on Elizabeth, things were overlooked. I hadn't considered Elizabeth's reaction or input at all to the death of Mary's first husband, which didn't occur to me. So that's why, it's so helpful. It's collaborative, isn't it? It's only because we're having this conversation that even occurred to me. And I've been so fortunate to be helped and supported by so many other historians on this journey who've said, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Or I don't think your theory is quite right there, or whatever. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think when doing my research on Thomas Seymour, there really was only one biography of sorts that had been done on him, and that was on his position as Lord High Admiral. And so from there, I thought, well, that's the only biography that I have on him, and the primary sources are very limited. So I immediately went to who were the important people around him, and maybe I'll find information there. And that's really how you end up building out, isn't it? You find them and you might find some more information.
Absolutely. We have very similar approaches in that. You think, where's my starting point? What work has been done already? Yeah. And then how can I build out from that? And it's been such a journey. I have found, so while I haven't found a trove of letters, we hold out hope, I have found some exciting overlooked sources that are being woven into the book that I can't wait to talk about, just some really exciting overlooked things. And I think it's not necessarily that no one gets cared about Elizabeth's story. It's just that because when you look for references to her directly, you do come up short. It is difficult. People reference her few and far between. But then if you think more broadly, if you read against the grain and think, okay, so we know she was in Catherine of Aragon's household from 1509. So where are references to Catherine and her ladies? Then there Elizabeth probably was. I think that she was an ordinary member of court. That is to say that she had a permanent member in a permanent position in the household. She appears in lots of lists of members of Catherine's household. She appears in gift rolls. 1513 is the one off the top of my head that she appears in. So she probably was permanently at court for majority of her time in Catherine's service. So that's how you fill that gap. You think there were jousts, there were banquets. She's mentioned by name at a banquet in 1517. So you think about, filling the gaps where you don't know where she was, but you can speculate that she was at jousts and pageants and possibly there when Catherine of Aragon had her several pregnancies. And it's all speculation, but it's grounded in, we know she was a lady in Catherine of Aragon's service. So probably. And is it better to even theoretically place her in these places rather than just not even thinking about her at all?
I love that you mentioned 1513, because my mind immediately went to Catherine of Aragon and the Battle of Flodden, and whether or not Elizabeth witnessed any of Catherine of Aragon's.
Well, again, what I was able to do when talking about that is, if we assume that Elizabeth Boleyn was at court in Catherine's service for that year, then we know that Catherine and her ladies sat together embroidering flags for the Battle of Flodden. Did Elizabeth Boleyn do that? Possibly. If she was there, and then she was there in January 1513. She's listed among Catherine's ladies as receiving, I think it's a gilt cup. They loved gilt cups. They were always giving each other gilt cups. Then probably she was one of those women who sewed flags for the Battle of Flodden. That's insane. That's so exciting. And it was finding out little things like that fill in the story, that add color to it, that add life to this woman who has been overlooked, who has been flattened by a lack of sources. When I found out that her sister Muriel, so Muriel's second husband, Edmund Knivet, he died in the sinking of the Regent, the worst maritime disaster of Henry VIII's reign. And then 6 months later, Muriel died in childbirth. And so that was one of the first things I found when I started to do my research. And you find that Elizabeth Boleyn had a brother-in-law who died in the worst maritime disaster of Henry VIII's reign, only then 6 months later for her sister to die. I didn't know that going into the project. I'm sure that a lot of listeners don't know that, because you think about Elizabeth Boleyn in the context of Anne's story, and that's complete, of course. Why would we be interested in her if she wasn't for Anne? But that's the draw for a lot of people. But she had a whole life before the Great Matter, before Anne even returned to England. And Thomas Boleyn was often off on diplomatic missions. So it would have been Elizabeth who was at court for that period representing the family, while the other members of the Boleyn family were off away. Elizabeth was in England. We know that she probably seems to only have left England for the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. She doesn't seem to have left England other than that. So for Henry VIII's early reign, she was often the sole representative of the family at court in Catherine of Aragon's service. And I think that is very interesting when you consider it alongside Thomas Boleyn's career. Often, as I'm sure you know, and listeners will know, court careers were divided between married couples. So you had the husband serving on the king's side and the wife serving on the queen's side. So Elizabeth Boleyn was serving Catherine of Aragon while Thomas Boleyn was serving Henry VIII. And those careers would have mirrored each other and complemented each other as well. That's just fascinating. We haven't thought about that. I've not seen it discussed. When you start to look, it's right there. When you just start to look for it, it's been there all along. It's fascinating.
I love this. This is great. So I think you had mentioned that Elizabeth came to court in 1527 with Anne.
Yes.
What did she come for? What was the reasoning behind that?
So this is one of the other things that is mentioned when people talk about Elizabeth. If she's mentioned in biographies of Anne, it will be in her context as Anne's chaperone during the courtship, which never makes it into media representations. But we have Elizabeth, when she's mentioned the court in 1527, it's in the company of Anne. And then, for example, she also was with Anne in 1529 when she, Anne, Henry, and I think it was Henry Norris, went to look at York Place after the fall of Cardinal Wolsey. Anne and Elizabeth were always in each other's company in the late 1520s. She was there as Anne's chaperone during the courtship with Henry, to ensure, that everything was proper. It was a typical role for a mother in, courtship situations. It just so happened that this was the king. So that's the capacity in which she was there.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned previously about Mary Boleyn and her secret marriage to Stafford and Elizabeth, and what was her role in all of that? I don't even remember what year that happened, but I believe it was after Anne married Henry.
That was 1534.
Okay.
So it seems like both Elizabeth and Thomas disapproved of the marriage that Mary made. In her famous letter to Cromwell, Mary said, I beseech you, good master secretary, pray my lord, my father, and my lady to be so good to us, and to let me have their blessings, and my father and my husband their goodwill. So the father obviously there is Thomas Boleyn, and then my lady is Elizabeth, because she references Anne elsewhere as the Queen's Grace. So that my lady must have been Elizabeth, who Mary is saying, please help me, my parents don't approve of my marriage. And it's understandable why Elizabeth, as a Howard, with someone who had such an understanding of the importance of lineage and how easily things could be taken away. She'd seen it in her own childhood with her father and their status. So while it seems harsh to us now, the fact that Mary was banished from court for that marriage, the marriage of love, is so she claims. To the family, it was, devastating. They lost Mary as a potential pawn on the marriage market, and it made them look bad. So it seems like, from Mary's own admission in that letter, her mother was not on board with that marriage, which is so interesting. Thomas Boleyn, because we have more on him, he's been cast as the villain in this story so often. It was Thomas Boleyn who pushed Anne into her relationship with Henry, even though we have evidence that he doesn't seem to have been on board with it for quite some time. Thomas Boleyn was the villain of this story who banished Mary from court for marrying a man that she loved. If we think that, I think that Thomas Boleyn's been massively cast as the bad guy when he really wasn't, not as much as we think. But he's borne the brunt of all of this historical judgment. Elizabeth hasn't borne any of it because she's just been ignored. She was also there. She was also a powerful figure. And Mary herself says in that letter, my father and my mother, my father and my lady. So if we're going to assume that Thomas Boleyn was a terrible father, which I don't hold with, Laura Mackay has done wonderful research, and I think the tide is really turning on the perception of Thomas Boleyn as a bad father, I think it was Eric Ives who said he climbed the greasy pole or whatever, then surely we have to say the same about Elizabeth Boleyn. But I think neither of them were bad parents, as we come to understand by modern standards. They simply were doing what was expected of them for their position at the time, especially during Anne's queenship as well. So long rambling answer again, I'm sorry.
No, I think it's interesting because when you put Thomas Boleyn in that scenario, of course, how does that make Anne Boleyn look? If her father is this scheming man who's making his daughter do something that she doesn't want to do, of course, that puts Anne Boleyn in a more sympathetic light too. And that helps to tell her story the way that some people have wanted to tell her story, when I think she is far more complicated than all of that.
So I completely agree. And I think that is why, I think it's because of how we've told Anne's story that Elizabeth's story has been overlooked. If you put aside the lack of direct primary source evidence and just assume, why haven't we even looked for Elizabeth Boleyn in this story? It's because we have two stories of Anne. We have either Anne as the victim of the men around her, the victim of her father's machinations, the victim of Henry's pursuit, who was powerless against the men around her. And so therefore Elizabeth Boleyn doesn't fit into that story, because you'd think, well, why didn't her mother try and help her if she was a good mother? Or was her mother in cahoots with Thomas Boleyn, also forcing her daughter there? But we just haven't put her there either. If you assume that Anne Boleyn was a vixen, a femme fatale, who seduced Henry away from his rightful first wife, then you can't allow for the fact that Elizabeth Boleyn was present during some of their courtship. We don't have evidence of much, but she was certainly there to chaperone. But in the Showtime's The Tudors, she's not there. She's dead, practically. Where is Elizabeth Boleyn in Showtime's The Tudors? She doesn't exist. So that's why I think, because we have had two versions, very broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, we've had those two versions of Anne as either a victim or a vixen. There is no space for her mother in either of those tellings of that story. And I think as well, because we like to imagine that Anne was a strong, independent woman, this feminist or this proto-feminist, the idea that she had a close, loving relationship with her mother, about whom we know so little, doesn't quite sit right. You can imagine that Anne was respectful of, Marguerite de Navarre or Margaret of Austria or even Catherine of Aragon, because we know that those were strong women who we can see quite clearly in the sources. But because Elizabeth Boleyn has left such a shallow imprint, it's led to the mistaken belief that she herself must have been this quiet, shy, reserved woman. So often in secondary sources, when people talked about Elizabeth Boleyn that I could find, I've compiled them for the introduction of the book, people say, she was a shadowy figure. We know so little. She had this cough in 1536. She was sickly and, she shuttered herself away at Hever Castle. That's the impression that you get when you look at Elizabeth Boleyn, when people talk about her at all. But it's just not true. It's not borne out in the primary sources. She was there much more often than we have allowed. And she must have had an influence on Anne more than we thought, because we hear it from Anne herself. So I think that's why. It's because of how we've looked at Anne that we haven't seen her mother, because Anne's story is so large, and so we have these views about Anne that haven't given space for her mother, who has her own story that needs to be told. So.
Oh, Sophie, I think this is like the perfect place now to end our conversation, because I want to leave some suspense for your book, right?
Yeah, of course. I was planning before coming to this conversation to give you a complete rundown of everything. But no, I want people to buy the book, which is not out for quite some time. But yes, there's so much more in the book that we haven't even discussed yet.
And if you don't yet follow Sophie on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, be sure to follow her on there. What's your handle over there?
It is Sophie B. Waterman.
Perfect. Give her a follow, see what she's doing. Sometimes we get little tidbits of her research. You get little clippings of letters and such that we can look at, which is one of my favorite things, is deciphering the paleography. When you post those things, I'm like, oh, I want to see if I can read this.
Yeah, I was looking at, like I mentioned earlier, I was looking at the pay books of James Needham the other day, and I was so proud of myself every time I could read an entire entry. And you think, because it's not just the secretary hand, it's also the spellings in some cases.
Yes.
I found Queen's Moder, spelled Modyr.
Oh.
And you have to just look at it and go, that is Queen's mother. I know that's what they were saying. It's very interesting, when you start to look at it. But I'm very good now at spotting Wiltshire in paleography. That's a word that I'm used to spotting, because that turns up a lot. Obviously, Elizabeth Boleyn being the Countess of Wiltshire.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am dropping pictures of sources and discussions all the time, like little tasters of the book, to keep people informed and excited. But the buzz around it has been just overwhelming, and I'm so flattered and pleased that people are excited that this story is being excavated now.
I'm very excited for your book to come out. I will be one of the first people lined up to purchase one when it does. And I want, I'm so grateful for you to come on the show today. And I hope to have you back again in the future to talk about some other topics as well.
I'd love to. It's been lovely. Thank you so much for letting me ramble about my research. It's always just a joy to, talk about it and share how it was done and what's been going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. As a patron, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, some patron-exclusive content, and even discounts on upcoming webinars and lectures. Head on over to Patreon today to find out more information. And for as little as $3 a month, you can show your support. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.